This episode is brought to you by Sterling Soap Company. Fellas, you've heard the phrase, look good, feel good, right? But why not add smell good to that too? That's where Sterling Soap Company comes in. First, Sterling Soap is 100% natural and has a wide variety of bath soaps, shave soaps, beard balm, lotions, and cologne. Second, there's a scent just for you. How about burgundy? Yeah, it's more than a color. The Sterling Soap folks blend natural essential oils with hints of mahogany, golden amber, and sandalwood. Or how about D503, an intensely masculine scent inspired by Legend by Mont Blanc. And third, you will feel good about the price. For just a little more than you'd pay at the grocery store, Sterling Soap will leave you feeling clean, refreshed, and ready for whatever's next. Give Sterling Soap a try today. Visit sterlingsoap.com.
Hey there, sports history fan. This is Darren Hayes, host of the Pigskin Dispatch and Jersey Dispatch podcast. I hope you've enjoyed another great episode here on Sports History Network. Now, speaking of sports history, this episode was brought to you by Firefly Books, and they have two great ones for you this summer. For basketball fans, they have the NBA 75, the definitive history by author Dave Zarum, who's appeared on our Jersey Dispatch podcast recently. He tells about the experience, the thrilling journey of the NBA, from its humble beginnings to its modern glory. Uncover the untold stories of triumph, controversy, and the greatest stars of the game. This isn't just a book. It's courtside seats to over 75 years of NBA history. And for the golf enthusiasts, swing into The Golf Round I'll Never Forget by Matt Adams. Relive 50 of golf's most memorable moments through the eyes of the legends themselves. From Garcia's triumph at the 2017 Masters to Nicklaus' miraculous 1986 comeback, it's the closest you'll get to walking the fairways with golf's greatest. Get your summer read on. Grab a copy of NBA 75 or The Golf Round I'll Never Forget, available online or at your favorite bookstore.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Hello once again, sports fans, and welcome to the podcast that gives you the best of sports from back in the day. And coming to you from the Sports History Network, this is the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast. I'm Dana Augusta, along with my co-host Charles Combs, and we will go deep in the woods to discuss and possibly debate sports history topics that you didn't know you needed to know. So pull up a chair, sit back and relax, and pump up the volume for a dose of sports history info and maybe even a few laughs. So with all that being said, here is the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast, a member of the Sports History Network. For most of the history of boxing, the heavyweight division was far and away the most popular and had stars that were larger than life. Fighters going back as far as the man they called the Boston Strong Boy, John L. Sullivan, to Gentleman Jim Corbett, to Jack Johnson, all the way up to Joe Frazier, George Foreman, Muhammad Ali, and also Mike Tyson. Yet, there was a time during the decade of the 1980s where there was a void in the heavyweight ranks, where it was between the retirement of Muhammad Ali and the rise of Mike Tyson. From out of that flux in the heavyweight division rose four boxers that rescued boxing from obscurity during the decade of excess, and neither of them were heavyweights. Hello once again, I'm your co-host Dana Augusta, and welcome to this all-new edition of the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast here on the Sports History Network, where we bring you the best of sports from back in the day. In this episode, co-host Charles Combs and I will discuss what is known in boxing circles as the Four Kings era, where four boxers, Sugar Ray Leonard, Roberto Duran, Marvin Hagler, and Thomas Hearns, were all at the top of the boxing world, and each one fighting each other, which seemed like every other month. Some of their fights during that time had become legendary, including one that we will highlight in our shoutout segment. On April 15, 1985, Marvin Hagler and Thomas Hearns entered the ring at Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas and put on one of the most memorable fights in boxing history, a fight that only lasted 3 rounds. So we have that going on, plus a whole lot of discussion about these four great fighters on this all-new edition of the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast, a member of the Sports History Network. And we're right back here on this edition of the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast, right here on the Sports History Network. I'm Dana Augusta, joined once again by Charles Combs, my co-host. And this is the first episode in the history of this podcast that we're just going to devote exclusively to boxing. And I'm so fortunate to have my co-host with me tonight to talk about this, because this is right in his wheelhouse, and it's really both in our wheelhouses because we are both children of the 1980s. And this era in boxing took place primarily in the decade of the 1980s. Right after the retirement of Muhammad Ali and right before the rise of Mike Tyson, there was something called the Four Kings era in boxing, which consisted of Sugar Ray Leonard, also consisted of Marvelous Marvin Hagler, Thomas Hitman Hearns, and Roberto Duran. And they've had some of the most epic fights throughout the decade of the 80s, and we're going to be talking about that here tonight. Chuck, glad to have you aboard once again, man. How you feeling tonight?
I'm feeling pretty good. Always a pleasure to have an opportunity to converse and talk shop with you, and I'm happy to be here and looking forward to tonight's discussion about the fight game.
All right, and like I say, you are a big connoisseur of the sweet science, and tonight we're going to be talking about the Four Kings era in boxing, which is it's an era that a lot of people don't really know of, because it's been the boxing game for most of its history has been pretty much, a lot of it from my point of view at least, has been more heavyweight divisional based. But this takes place in middleweight, welterweight area, between these four fighters that are just introduced. And overview, when you hear the term the Four Kings era, what do you think of?
Well, I think first of all, you mentioned at the outset that it kind of happened between the end of Muhammad Ali and before the rise to prominence of Mike Tyson. So there was a little lull in there. And at the time, all-time great heavyweight himself, Larry Holmes, was heavyweight champion at the time, but he wasn't quite, he was a great fighter, but he didn't have the charisma and the flashy fighting style of Ali, nor was he as loquacious, and he also didn't have just the brutality and sheer destruction style of Mike Tyson. So it was kind of like he was kind of like forgotten about, and it was kind of like a little lull as far as heavyweights were concerned, even though it was still very popular, which in turn created a void in the rise of the four stars that we're going to discuss today. And what really stands out to me about these four guys is how great they were. They could fight every style. And when you go through their resumes, like how contrast to today, you have guys like Tank Davis, for example. Excuse me, dude is 30 years old, still fighting the prospect schedule, so everybody, he's good. Like, dude, when are you going to fight somebody? These guys, age 20, 21, 22, they were fighting super fights. They were not stalling these fights out. And all four of these guys welcomed and thirsted for all the smoke, as they would say.
See, that's the difference between the fight game now as opposed to the fight game the way it was back when we were coming up, when we were growing up, when we first started watching the heavyweight, started watching boxing all in general. Because I'm a kid of a kid. I'm somebody who used to watch Top Rank Boxing on ESPN with my grandpa. Seemed like every Thursday night that it came on, and hearing stories from my grandpa, and then all of that coincided, my childhood coincided with the height of the Four Kings era, which we're talking about here tonight. First off, let me do this, and I've always wanted to do this, especially with you from somebody that is very knowledgeable about the fight game. I'm going to mention one fighter's name, and what I want you to do is give me just one word to describe him. If you could describe them in one word, describe that. What is that one word? Okay, first one. Sugar Ray Leonard.
Electric.
with his footwork, with the way that, he was just such a dynamic tactician as far as that's concerned. I solely agree with you on that. Next one, Roberto Duran.
Vicious.
He was one, they called him the hands of stone. And he was one of those guys that would just come at you and would just fight. He was one of those guys that seemed like he could fight you in a phone booth. He's very close in, he's one of those guys that would just like be into you the whole fight, and we're going to get to this in a moment. But one thing I did not realize that he was fighting until 2000.
Yes, and he didn't quit until he had an accident at age 50, which kind of precluded him from continuing his career because as a result of the accident, it required life-saving surgery. And he finally hung him up at the age of 50.
50 years old and he was still fighting. That's I did not realize that until I started doing research on this. Next one, Thomas Hitman Hearns.
Sniper.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the four fighters that we're talking about here. That's the one I had to do the most research on because I didn't know that much about him. I knew about Sugar Ray Leonard, obviously. I knew about Roberto Duran, obviously. Of these four fighters, Marvelous Marvin Hagler was my favorite. Okay, and I already knew a lot about him. But Thomas Hitman Hearns, while doing research and watching film of him, dude, I tell you, he was something to deal with. He was a power puncher if there ever was one. And last but not least, Marvelous Marvin Hagler.
Versatile.
Yes, because he could beat you anyway. If you want to get into a slugfest, which we're going to talk about later, you could do that. But if he wants to sit down there and just basically go blow for blow with you, just kind of wear you down with tactics and that sort of thing, he could do that as well. So,
right.
Again, this is going to be a very interesting episode, I really do believe. With your expertise in the boxing game, I've been looking forward to this since we came up with the idea a few weeks ago. So let's get started with Sugar Ray Leonard. Okay, let me give you a little background on him. He competed professionally from 1977 to 1997, winning world titles in 5 weight divisions. He was the lineal championship in 3 weight classes, as well as the undisputed heavyweight championship. Leonard was part of the Four Kings, as we're talking about here, and he was best known for, winning the 1976 Summer Olympics. Let's talk about Sugar Ray Leonard for a second. What are when you think of him, and what's the thing that goes through your mind? What's the thing that comes to mind when you think of him?
First thing that immediately comes to mind from him is total facade, and I mean that in the best light possible. You take a look at this guy, after the 76 Olympics, just to back up for a second, dude was the first fighter to earn $100 million in purses. So
that's right. Yeah.
So he had a lot of appeal. I still remember he and his son on the 7-Up commercials.
That's
he had
right,
his face everywhere. He had the perfect throw, the radiant smile, and all of that, and had this clean-cut image.
Yeah.
But facade in the best way possible, because behind the mask of that, he was an absolute killer. Just an absolute killer. He didn't mind getting dirty, whatever he had to do to win a fight. And I always thought about him was, like a lot of guys in the prime money-making position, obviously you can kind of plot your own course, so to speak, because you're the money man. Everyone wants to fight you. A lot of these guys, they kind of avoid the best challenges at the right times. Whereas he, on the other hand, he was not that. He was a guy, you line him up, I'm going to do my damnedest to knock him down.
I mean, he was the boxer of the decade of the 1980s, which I kind of knew that, because, of all the fighters that we saw growing up, that was the one fighter that everybody knew. Everybody knew Sugar Ray Leonard. Again, this was the era between Muhammad Ali and before Mike Tyson. And Mike Tyson became big in the later part of the decade, of course, in the heavyweight division. Boxer of the decade of the 1980s. Ring Magazine named him the Fighter of the Year 1971 and 1979 and 1981. And the Boxing Writers Association of America named him Fighter of the Year 1976, 79, 81, And in 2002, Sugar Ray Leonard was voted Ring Magazine's as the ninth greatest fighter in the last 80 years. And in 2016, it was voted by Ring Magazine to be the greatest living fighter. So there's a lot of accolades with Sugar Ray Leonard, and rightly so, because his career is one of the most, inspiring is one way to put it, but it's also one of the most exciting. When I think of Sugar Ray Leonard, I think of him, a lot of people back then called it showboating. I call it swagger. Of the four guys that we talked about here tonight, I think he had the most swagger of all of them. And he can back it up. It's just like you said, it's a great word that you use, facade. But I think that a lot of it is swagger. Now, of course, to be a boxer, you have to have some type of swagger, but he had it in loads. He had it in truckloads of swagger. And, do you agree with that?
Quite agree with that quite a bit. He was very, very charismatic. And then to think, like how you mentioned that, how he was the most popular fighter of the 80s and all of that, to think that it almost did not happen.
Right.
Because when he won the gold in Montreal in 76, he had was gifted a scholarship to the University of Maryland, and he planned to study business administration. He didn't even have initially any intent of turning professional, but then some extenuating circumstances. For example, his girlfriend at the time, he had placed him on child support. So he was hoping to leverage the gold medal win and the fame of that into endorsement opportunities. But the paternity suit kind of quelled all of those aspirations. And then in addition to that, both of his parents were hospitalized. His father was hospitalized with meningitis and his mom had a heart attack. So in order to kind of address all of those circumstances in his life, he had to go pro. And he was quite charismatic, and he kind of almost was like a disciple of Muhammad Ali, because his trainer, the great legendary
Angelo Dundee, right?
Angelo Dundee, he was Ali's trainer as well. So it's kind of like that lineage and that connection there.
That's right. He made his professional debut on February 5th, 1977, at the Civic Center in Baltimore, in Maryland. Paid $40,000 for the fight. And his opponent was Louis the Bull Vega, whom he defeated in a 6-round unanimous decision. But his 14th professional fight, Leonard fought his first world-ranked opponent, Floyd Mayweather. Does that name sound familiar? Who was ranked 17th. The fight took place on September 11th, 1978, and won by 10th round knockout. Okay. Leonard would later fight Wilfred Benitez, another fighter from our generation that I know a lot about. In 1979 at Caesars, Leonard received $1 million in Benitez, a two-time division champ with a record of 38-0-1. Wilfred Benitez was another one that I think should be kind of like on this list, because he pretty much throughout the decade of the 80s was fighting all these guys. Every now and then you see, Wilfred Benitez pop up every now and then. He was, another great fighter, during that time period.
Yes, and a lot of times in boxing circles, he's kind of considered unofficially as the fifth king. In a lot of ways, because he was a tremendous fighter, Puerto Rican born, great, represented that island or that land very, very well.
Yes.
Slick fighter. And then what's really impressive about him is the brother became world champion like at age 17 or something.
Yes.
It was just like just slick and just all of that. And that battle with Leonard was very, very tactical throughout until he was Leonard was finally able to get the edge and kind of beat him by late stoppage and all of that. But then, as you mentioned before, he kind of excluding Hagler, because naturally Hagler was too big, but he would go on to have his own battles with Duran and Hearns respectively.
Yes, right. Okay, June 20th, 1980. Leonard returned to Olympic Stadium in Montreal to defend his title against Roberto Duran, the other one of the kings, in their first ever matchup, this time in Olympic Stadium. And this kind of threw I keep saying Muhammad Ali, I don't know why, but this kind of threw Sugar Ray Leonard into like a little bit of a tizzy because it was in Olympic Stadium, but he realized that the crowd was more towards Roberto Duran. I remember watching this fight a couple of days ago, and there was a huge segment of the crowd that seemed to be rooting for Roberto Duran. And I wonder why that was. Do you understand why that was? Possibly.
Well, they had a large Panamanian contingent in Montreal as well. And then I guess for some reason that Duran had resonated with the Canadian fans. And kind of a little tidbit just to kind of set the table just right. Duran got to superstardom in the 1980s, but by the 1980s, the man was already, basically Hall of Fame bound because his lightweight reign throughout the 70s, he was, often considered the greatest lightweight that's ever lived in a lot of circles. Not getting too far ahead of ourselves, but I'm just saying that to say that perhaps due to him, kind of fighting throughout the 70s, he probably had like pretty much renowned, had an established fan base and so forth and all of that. And then, in Montreal, the brawl in Montreal.
That's what it was. It's called the brawl in Montreal, which is cool. Yes. One thing about boxing, one of the bouts back then, especially big bouts, they all had nicknames. They all had the brawl in Montreal, the showdown, the war, and all of this. And you don't see that anymore, and I think it just added a little bit of gravitas to the fight game back then when each fight seemed like it had a name. You get what I'm saying? So,
yes.
Duran comes into this fight with a record of 71-1.
Correct.
71-1. He had been lightweight champion for 6.5 years up to that point, and number one welterweight contender and the best pound for pound fighter in the world at the time. And here you are, here's Duran fighting this quote unquote Olympic champion, and what happens after that? Duran beats him.
Well, there's a lot of caveats to that because, first of all, he was worked into a fervor because, even though he had been established, had been around longer since Sugar Ray had the star power, and it was his division. They were fighting for Leonard's title. He had the lion's share of the purse, so he was taken aback by that. But then also, if you remember, in the build up to the fight, Duran said some really nasty things to Sugar Ray's wife. I mean, some of this stuff I can't.
You can't really say.
I can't repeat. Some of this stuff about what he would do with her, things along those ways. So it worked. Sugar Ray into a fury, and one of the key attributes that we failed to mention at the beginning when we were kind of talking about an overview as far as Leonard is concerned. Part of his strengths is his IQ. His boxing IQ was off the charts, but then he was a master at the head game. He was a master at getting into his opponent's head and gaining the psychological edge. But it worked against him. I think this is where he kind of really mastered it, because Duran, by the time the buildup of the fight was over and the fight had come, he was so enraged with beating Duran and trying to knock Duran out. The fight was called the Brawl in Montreal, and he in fact fought it in a brawl-like fashion because he was so darn mad that all of his strategy and all of his advantage, he didn't fight to any of those. He had superior hand speed, foot speed, things like that. But he stood there toe to toe with Duran and fought Duran's fight, which the tone of the fight definitely turned things significantly into Duran's favor, resulting in Duran's victory. Did you remember at the end of the 15 rounds when Sugar Ray tried to hug him, he pushed him off and then waved him off and spit and just started cussing to the crowd and everything because he was still pissed off. You know what I mean? So just a great fight.
It was a great fight, and that's one of the things about boxing that is kind of lacking over the last few years is the fact that it was a spectacle. You had 45,000 fans at Olympic Stadium in Montreal to see this fight, and it was an absolute spectacle. Duran won, and Sugar Ray was still furious at the end of the fight after Duran's disparaging remarks, obviously, but he wouldn't have to wait long to have their second fight. And this one is even more famous than this one for what happened and the phrase that came out of this fight that had dogged Duran for the remainder of his career.
Yes, and part of the lead up to the fight, you said it happened really quickly, right? Mm-hmm. So when Duran won the fight, it just propelled him to legendary status, and he basically was a king back in his homeland of Panama. So, how can I put this? To the victor goes the spoils, if you know what I'm saying. When he went back to Panama, he was enjoying the thrill of the victory and said spoils. I don't have to spell it out. You kind of know what that entails pretty much.
Right.
Partying and drinking, and then he was always known to really gain a significant amount of weight between fights. So this is where I was talking about earlier, like when you're kind of in that face of boxing spot, you can kind of dictate a lot of terms, even if you're not the champion, just simply because you're the bigger star. So Leonard knew that he was known to blow up in between fights. So what he wanted to do was get him back in the ring as soon as possible, because he knew he was partying and all of that. And then he probably gained a little bit more weight between fights than he normally would. And that would give him a very, very short period of time to get back to the 147-pound welterweight limit, which would in turn tilt the scales in the favor of Leonard. And, the said bout unbelievably took place in November 1980s in New Orleans. And I'll just say that because we're both Louisianans. I'm from Baton Rouge, which is approximately 80 miles, it's technically an hour from Baton Rouge to New Orleans. The way I drive, I can do it in 40 minutes. But
I know that firsthand.
I was just saying that to say it was just amazing how many fights used to be in New Orleans at that time, like that fight. They also had, you remember the rematch between Muhammad Ali and Leon Spinks.
Leon Spinks was there
in New Orleans. They used to have. You remember, not getting too far ahead of ourselves. I know you're not a wrestling fan, but they used to have Mid-South Wrestling, Junkyard.
I was a wrestling fan back then. Talking about early 80s, early mid 80s. Yeah, I was. I may not be one now, but back then, oh heck, yeah. I've been to a couple of shows in the Superdome, during that time. The rematch in New Orleans, and this is basically like a recurring theme between Sugar Ray Leonard and Roberto Duran, because he would know, to your point, that he would know that Duran had problems, had fluctuated weight throughout his career. That if there was one thing about Roberto Duran, that he was going to gain weight in between fights. That was something that was almost a given. Going to Panama, drinking, partying, eating well, taking advantage of all of the spoils of victory that you were just saying. He would gain weight, and that was Sugar Ray's weight, because you see that all the time. You see that in going into their third fight, which happened later on in the decade. That they fought. It was like Uno Mas, which was the name of that fight. But this one, the rematch was billed as Stone versus Sugar. See, like I said, another great title for this fight. 25,000, 38 fans paid in attendance. Now, you know me. Now, you know this. I know this and you know this, but as both guys who grew up in Louisiana, if everybody that said that they were at that fight were really there, that fight would have had 100,000 people.
Yes.
Everybody you've run into, you talk about Roberto Duran, the Sugar Ray Leonard, Roberto Duran second fight. Oh yeah, I was there. I was sitting up at the mezzanine section. I was over here. Yeah, that was one of those sports events in history that if everybody said they were there, really there, the Superdome that fight would have had 100,000 people, easy. And it was legendary. It was a legendary fight for how it ended more than anything.
Yes. And Sugar Ray, unlike the first fight when he allowed his emotions to get the best of him, which resulted in him employing the incorrect tactics. In this fight, the rematch, he fought much more to his natural advantages, which were moving, boxing, things like that. So he came in, kind of pulled the Roberto Duran on Roberto Duran in the rematch.
Right.
He came dressed in all black, and then he started fighting. He started fighting from the outside, boxing him. Duran was having much more difficulty cutting the ring off, which enabled Sugar Ray to get off his jab, establish his jab, get off those super duper combinations, and then kind of round 4 or 5, when he started seeing the fight going his way, then he went for the kill in terms of, from a mental standpoint, he started taunting Duran.
Yes, I remember that.
A couple of times he did the Ali shuffle. A couple of times he did the old what you call that punch when you wind up?
The wind up punch.
The wind up. What you call it? The bolo. The bolo punch and all of that. Then there was even a couple of times where, since he had masterfully established his distance with his jab, he had the right distance. He'll stick his chin out to Roberto. Then Roberto swing, he moves it back out. So as a result of all the taunting and all of the clean blows, Duran got increasingly frustrated, and which led to what you said. The infamous phrase was, and I'll leave that to you in terms of what occurred then.
Okay, in the closing seconds of the 8th round. Okay, the taunting and everything started in round 7. Okay, as Roberto Duran was just trying to, Sugar Ray would try this bolo punch and then, do all of these antics, basically taunting him the whole time. Hence, I talk about the swagger. In the closing seconds of the 8th round, Duran turned his back. He says, "No mas, no more," and all of his trainers and everything, like, what is he? And the announcers of the fight, like, wait a minute, what is he doing? And he's just waving his hands off, says, "No more, I quit." Hence the term "no mas," which became a catchphrase which had dogged Duran because he quit in the middle of the fight, which a lot of people were literally shocked that happened, because he was being embarrassed so much during the fight that he basically said, "You know what? I've had enough. I'm done." And according to reports, Duran said he quit because of stomach cramps caused by overheating after the weigh-in. And at the end of the 5th round, he got cramps in his stomach, allegedly. Then at the end, he felt weaker and weaker during the fight and everything. No, he was just getting played the whole night. He can cycle by stomach cramps. I'm not buying that for 1 second at all. I'm just not buying that. He was getting played.
Correct. He was getting beaten. Now, to give some little caveat in terms of the contrast between the fight game at that time versus the fight game now. Now, in terms of his stomach cramps and things like that, of course, that was hogwash, of course.
Yeah.
But back then, they used to have the same day weigh-in. Like if you fight, like for instance, if you and I get it on tonight, we step on the scales around noontime earlier today to weigh in and all that. It's not like this stuff.
Like about a week before. Like about a week before. Yeah.
No, you get the weigh-in the day before. And then like a lot of times, even when they have the weigh-ins now in the evening time, it is called, quote unquote, the ceremonial weigh-in, because the actual weigh-in took place earlier that day. Like a lot of times I see fights now, by the time they come to the ceremonial weigh-in, I already know the weights because they weighed in earlier that day. And then of course, boxing insiders leak the weights and all of that. So they get an entire 24 plus hours to rehydrate and replenish and things like that. Whereas back then, you only got roughly 6 to 8 hours.
Right. Okay. So Everybody was, again, surprised by Duran's actions. Freddie Brown and Ray Arcel, which was their trainers, they said, quote, I was shocked, Freddie Brown said. I was shocked. There was no indication that he was in any pain or getting weak. Arcel said he was angry. That's it. I've had it. This is terrible. I've handled thousands of fighters, and I've never had anyone quit on me. And that would dog Roberto Duran for the rest of his career. We're going to get into his career in a sec. But that would dog Roberto Duran for the rest of his career.
Yes, and then it's one thing. Like, quitting is bad.
Yeah,
it's bad. It's the worst thing you can do. But in Latino culture, quitting is a death sentence. In Latino culture, it's
that's
like
right. That's
right.
Like
Latino fighters, they are known for their grit, their determination, and they're known for their passionate fan base where they're behind them. And even if you lose, if you fight and you put on in the fight, they will still support you, no questions asked.
Yeah.
But you quit. It's bad, period. But it's just magnified exponentially within Latino culture and Latino fan bases. If you quit, they got certain words that they use starts with a P. A P, and,
a couple of them.
Yeah, that's the worst thing you could do. And then, as you mentioned before, it would plague him for a lot of the remainder of his career because it kind of undid, as great as he was, as I mentioned, in the 70s. I know we're talking about Sugar Ray Leonard. He was the fighter of the decade in the 70s, known as the greatest white lightweight that ever lived. But at that moment, once he said no mas superseded all of those things. And no mas is what he became known as, not the reigning lightweight champion,
not the hands of stone, none of that.
Not the hands of, he became known as the guy that said no mas.
Yes, it basically put a pause on his whole entire career. Then Sugar Ray Leonard would fight another up-and-coming guy in 1981, September 16th, 1981, at Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas, some guy by the name of Thomas Hitman Hearns. In 1981, they fought before a live crowd of 23,000. Hearns was paid $5.1 million, and Leonard made over $11 million. The fight grossed over $35 million, and the live gave with $5.9 million, and the revenue from pay-per-view, they had pay-per-view back then, $7.5 million. Hearns came in with a 32-0 record with 30 knockouts and won the WBA welterweight championship in 1980, scoring the second round knockout of Jose Cuevas in Detroit. Now, let's talk about this fight here. Another one of the four kings that we're going to talk about a little bit later. Let's talk about this fight here.
Well, this fight here, as I mentioned in my introductory episode, this fight resulted in me, I was 6 at the time, crying tears at the end of the night. And as I also mentioned, you mentioned that the fight was on pay-per-view. But these were the days prior to when you could order the pay-per-view into your own home. These were the days when you had to go to like a venue, a movie theater, or a stadium and watched it on something called closed circuit TV.
Closed circuit TV.
Now, our young listeners, I'm learning you something right now, as my late uncle would say. Like everybody around our age, we kind of know what that was like. And then this fight, it was like the quintessential boxer in Sugar Ray Leonard versus Tommy Hearns, who was the puncher in the fight. But it started out, it was before the fight, it was like, okay, in order for Leonard to win, he has to box Tommy, offset him, avoid that right hand, and outbox him. Whereas on the other hand, Hearns' key to victory was establishing that jab, one of the top 5 jabs of all time, by the way.
Oh, yeah.
And landing that money right hand, which is also one of the top 5 right hands all the time, arguably. I'm beginning to sound like a broken record, but the truth is the truth. And it was this fight was amazing because a lot of times you don't know how a fight is going to play out until you get in the ring. And what's amazing about it, when you're fighting against all of these guys were complete fighters, but you learn something about fighters when they fight other great fighters. And this was no exception. Like the fight started out with Leonard trying to box Hearns, but he had tremendous problems with the long jab of Hearns. Hearns was 6'1", 6'1" with a 78-inch arm reach, which is insane for a welterweight. For just brief comparison, Muhammad Ali was 6'3" with a 78-inch arm reach. So this guy has the same arm reach as a legendary heavyweight champion, but he's a 147-pounder. So he had tremendous difficulty handling Hearns' jab. So
not to cut you off, but
go ahead.
With Hearns, one of the things that always struck me with him was his height and his long reach. With somebody, if you have like a jab that you just constantly flicking the way that Thomas Hearns did, you're not going to be able to get too close. And that was his style, like he'll just flick the jack, and next thing you know, you try to come in with something and he'll hit you with that powerful right hand that he had, and then that's lights out. That's why they call him the Hitman. Leonard had a badly swollen eye in this fight. As the fight would go, not to get too far ahead, but that's what one of the things that really slowed Leonard down was that jab that Hearns had, and he really kept Leonard on his toes. It was none of this showboating or swagger or taunting in this fight from Leonard. Absolutely not in this one.
Oh, no, sir. And then like Tommy, speaking of Tommy's jab, it's not like these fighters now where a lot of times they'll fire the jab a little bit. They don't throw it with any conviction, or like a lot of times they'll throw it as a kind of a range finding jab, or some of the fighters, not as much now, you could throw it as a probing jab where you're not necessarily trying to land it, but you're trying to see how he reacts, which way he slips, so he can possibly set up the other shot. So you're kind of probing him. But anyway, he was having trouble with that. And to your point, as you alluded to, he began to have swelling under his left eye. And, Hearns was ahead on the scorecards. Come round 6, Leonard finally gets to him and lands his money shot and hurt Hearns badly. Almost stopped him. He punished Hearns through round 6 and 7. But then, as I mentioned just a moment ago, how you think something going into a fight, but then you learn something about great fighters fighting other great fighters. Hearns kind of got himself together under the tutelage of the legendary gym trainer Emmanuel Stewart. So that was a great matchup too. Emmanuel Stewart versus
Angelo Dundee.
Dundee, legendary matchup trainer-wise. But anyway, Hearns began to get up on his toes, flicking the jab, boxing, and all of that. And to your point, the man was like 32-0 with 31 KOs coming into the fight. So here go the man boxing, moving, and all of that.
Yeah.
So the roles have now become reversed. Hearns was the boxer, and now Leonard is the puncher, where he has to get the Hearns, and people were amazed because Hearns was just blasting everybody out of there. Mm-hmm. People were amazed at Hearns' ability to box so well, and he won like he took control of the fight again, and then around 12-13, the legendary phrase everybody remembers it who saw the fight. The old Angelo Dundee, he knows, a legendary trainer knows when to really give, like a lot of times we always talk about, like, you can have the advice, but you have the timing of the advice is just as important as the advice. And he referred to Leonard. He said, look, you're blowing it, son. You're blowing it, son. and Leonard responded and finally got to Hearns in the 13th round, hurt Hearns again in the 13th. And then one thing, even though Tommy could box very well, one thing he had mastered at that point of his career was how to clinch and how to hold when he got into trouble. He always tried to fight his way out of it, right? And he had a tremendous arsenal to do so, but against somebody like Leonard, that's bad. And then that eventually led to like a 14th round stoppage and the crying tears. And Hearns was on ahead on all three scoring cards at the end of the stoppage, and basically he just needed to remain upright and he would have won, but
Yeah,
he got stopped.
that's right. That's right. I mean, you think about that fight. Angelo Dundee's words, "You're blowing it, son. You're blowing it." I mean, everybody knows that line. That lives on. And that lives on forever. And you mentioned it. You had Emmanuel Stewart in one corner, Angelo Dundee in another corner. That is a legend. That is almost Angelo Dundee and Eddie Futch. Back in the 70s. That's like a matchup of trainers to that level. And it's like styles make fights. That's the common parlance in all of boxing. Styles make fights. You have two guys with differing styles, but each one of them was so versatile. And each one of these guys that we're talking about here, each one of these guys are so versatile that they could change the way they are so smart, and their IQs of boxing are so high that they realize what's going on in front of them in the middle of the ring and say, okay, I need to change up some things. Okay. And come out with a totally different game plan than what you came in with and still be successful. They're not doing anything that is totally out of character for them, which is why they were so versatile and such of a, each one of these guys were just so talented during this era of great boxing.
Yes, and I mean, and as I mentioned before, we found out that Tommy could actually box instead of just blast everyone out of there, Ivan Drago style. Yeah. But what we also found out, it was what I mentioned earlier about the facade. We really found out that behind all of the boyish charms and the movie star good looks and the smile and hair always perfect, that Sugar Ray was just a dog.
He was tough. He was a lot tougher than he looks. I've always said, that Sugar Ray Leonard is one of the prettiest boxers I've ever saw. And I still say that to this day. He was just as pretty as Muhammad Ali. Okay, but the guy was tough. I mean, you got to give credit where credit is due. I mean, the guy was really tough, and I was like, just looking back on his career, I'm like, this guy got beat up a lot. Okay, but it doesn't really you don't really see it, I told my wife that I was doing this, and she's like, you got to spend a lot of time with Sugar Ray Leonard because she has a crush on Sugar Ray Leonard, or even to this day, that's her deal. She had crushes on two athletes. Unfortunately, one of them is no longer with us. She had a crush on Sugar Ray Leonard and Franco Harris. So
Franco Harris?
Yes.
Okay, fine. I get to each his own, I guess. You know what I mean?
She had a huge crush on Franco Harris. But anyway, but moving on.
Yes.
Okay, Dan. Okay, the fight was named that fight that we're talking today. We just got through talking about. Fight was Fight of the Year by Ring Magazine. Leonard was named the Fighter of the Year by the Ring and Boxing Writers Association of America. He was Athlete of the Year by ABC. This was essentially, after this fight, he became pretty much Sugar Ray Leonard. He became like the spokesman, the spokesperson for everything from 7-Up to, Everlast gloves and everything. You remember. But this was, it was a lot of controversy during the fight, especially the scoring during rounds 6 and 7. Even though Leonard dominated in Hearns battle, all three judges awarded the rounds to Leonard, even though he was just getting pummeled. So that was a lot of controversy. And one of the things you're going to see in these fights, that there were some controversy following these fights. The next one, March 10th, 1986, highlighted Sugar Ray Leonard's career. Sugar Ray Leonard against another guy that we're going to talk about a little later, Marvin Hagler. To retain the undisputed world heavyweight middleweight championship for the 12th round and advance to his record 62-2-2. But let's talk about that fight just real quickly.
Okay, well, to back into that, to set the table just right, after he fought Hearns, he had discovered that he had fought with a detached retina, and he fought once in February 1982, retired. Then he came back briefly in May of '84 to fight Kevin Howard. Got dropped in the fight, but he wound up winning by knockout. But I guess he felt he didn't have it anymore, and he retired again. So by the time he fought Hagler, Hagler, he had been retired 3 years and had only fought twice in 5 years. So when he fought him and all of that, it was a lot of concessions that in exchange for Hagler getting the lion's share of the purse, it was a lot of concessions that Hagler had to make on the other end in order to get the lion's share of the money. I'll just briefly name a few. First, the normal ring size was expanded. Obviously, that would favor Leonard since his plan was to move around and box anyway. Secondly, as opposed to at the time the customary 8-ounce gloves, 10-ounce gloves were mandated, which are, slow the hands down, a little bit more cushion. And then last but not least, the typical 15-round championship schedule, it was scheduled for 12 rounds instead. And coming into this fight, Leonard was a prohibitive underdog, and many people feared for him because the viciousness of the fight that we're going to talk about a little bit later, they thought people were thinking that he could possibly lose his eye.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that a lot of people that are younger than us don't realize is the fact that a lot of fights back then went 15 rounds instead of 12, and I want to say that there was a reason for that not too long after or before this, or not too long within the same vicinity with Ray Boom Boom Mancini and with him and Dooku Kim and Ray Mancini and Dooku Kim actually dies at the end of, toward like a couple days after the fight from his injuries because it went 15 rounds. It was a brutal fight, and a lot of boxing decided, we think 15 rounds is a little bit too much. Now you got to remember, back in the early part of the 20th century, you had fights that would go to 50, 60 rounds, which is ridiculous. Now they went from that to like 15 and then dropping from 15 to 12, which is standard now, for all title fights. But back then in the early 80s, as late as the early 80s, you saw fights go 15 rounds and there was no problem, but right after the Ray Boom Boom Mancini Dooku Kim fight, I want to say that was in 1986, right around the same year. I think it was in 86.
It was around up in there. Yes.
And, and he was from Korea, and the Korea fighter, ends up dying in the hospital, which has a whole, that fight itself and the aftermath of the fight is absolutely, that's a podcast episode to itself. And all the stuff that happened in that fight between him dying and the mother and the referee committing suicide. And it was a mess. That whole fight was just a mess. And there's something else you don't see every day. That fight was outside.
Caesar's Palace, baby.
Caesar's Palace outside in the daytime.
Mm-hmm. Yes,
that's
sir.
Wow. I mean, it looked like they were fighting in somebody's backyard. Anyway.
Yes. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
But talking about this fight here, the Hearns Hagler fight. I mean, not Hearns Hagler, Sugar Ray Leonard, Marvin Hagler. Excuse me. In '86, let's talk about that one a little bit. You were talking about all of the specifications that Sugar Ray Leonard wanted heading into this fight. And we talked about that. Let's talk about the fight itself.
Well, coming into the fight, Marvin Hagler was like the champion, the man of the division for the last 7 years. He ruled that division with an iron fist. So coming into the match, obviously Sugar Ray Leonard had the box. And, it's a couple things like leading up to that, which we may talk about a little later on the Marvin Hagler side. So I'll pass on that now, but we'll bookmark that, folks. We'll revisit a little later. But
right.
Anyway, in that fight, Leonard utilized a lot of movement, a lot of boxing. He didn't want to really engage or minimize the exchanges. And I remember Hagler famously told him, quit fighting like a bee, whatever. And then Sugar Ray say, no way, my man, no way. Unlike before, where Duran had kind of gotten in his head to make him fight the wrong fight. He had matured in that way, but knew that fighting the wrong fight in this instance could be, deadly pretty much. So
it would be.
He did that, and then he employed strategic tactics, like, for example, like he told his corner, like, every time when he gets 10 seconds left in the round, just tell me 10 seconds. So then he would throw these flurries at the end of the round in an effort to punctuate the round and sway the judges to score.
Yeah, I was just about to ask you about that. That was like you saw that throughout that fight.
Yes.
And you actually could hear either Angelo Dundee or somebody in the corner saying, "Yo, 10 seconds every single time," and then next thing you know, you just start going off. And that was I guess that was a smart tactic by him, because you always remember the last thing you saw.
Correct.
And that was a very interesting tactic that he employed.
Correct. And then, since boxing is a subjective sport in terms of the scoring, because it just depends on how the main three judges see a score of the fight. Like, for instance, you and I, we can watch the exact same fight, but have two totally different opinions in terms of who's the victor or who controlled the fight and things like that. So it was a very, very close fight, a lot of swing rounds, but basically, they had a deal where, like, at the end of the fight, Leonard won by controversial split decision.
Yes.
118, 110. What fight was now? That guy scorecard should have been investigated, because basically that's just like 10 rounds for Leonard, 2 for Hagler. There's no, even if you felt the man won the fight, there's no way that was the proper score. And then the other two judges scored at 15-13, one in favor of Leonard 7 rounds to 5, and the other 7 rounds to 5 in favor of Hagler. And before I turn it over to you, Hagler claimed at the end of the fight, when the fight was over with, that Leonard told him that, you beat me, man. Congratulations. An accusation that Leonard has vehemently denied throughout the years.
Yes. The thing is that I remember this fight as a kid. I was in junior high at the time. This might have been the last fight that I remember that everybody was talking about it weeks after it was over. And people were still talking about how controversial it was. And one of my friends had actually had a chance, like maybe a week after, had got a VHS copy of it. And we went back to his house and watched it after school one day. And we were just sitting here watching it, and we were like, I don't know. There was so much controversy afterwards. It's like, I don't really know, because it was like it was a brutal fight, to say the least. But, Leonard came out on top.
Yeah.
But one of the most controversial split decisions of all time.
Yeah. Now, it's always these rules in boxing, these unofficial rules in boxing, which are unofficial rules, but they're not really the actual rules. The criteria, the fight is determined on basically 12 various stanzas. Whoever win the majority of said 12 stanzas win the fight. Excuse me, I'm sorry. But they have things like, you got to take the belt from the champion, which I believe, but in terms of scoring a fight, that's not necessarily the case. But I'm just saying that to say that, many felt that Leonard had not done enough, because even though he landed more blows, it's a lot of flurries, a lot of soft blows where Hagler had landed the more telling punches and things like that. And it was so controversial that the official press roll scoring of the fight went as follows. 17 had Leonard as the winner. 18 had the fight in favor of Hagler, and 6 writers, press row members, had it as a draw.
So it was. So man, that's.
So basically, and I've rewatched the fight a gazillion times, and every time I watch it, I'm still left with my original decision. I had Marvin Hagler winning 7 rounds to 5.
All right.
I've always felt Hagler won the fight.
Okay. So Leonard would face Hearns one more time, 1989. Okay. And which was Sugar Ray Leonard versus Thomas Hearns, Part 2, promoted as The War. Okay. And it was guaranteed $11 million. Hearns was guaranteed $11 million, and Sugar Ray was guaranteed $14 million. Okay. And so let's talk about this fight. So it really didn't, Thomas Hearns dropped Ray Leonard in the 3rd round,
Correct.
But he came back and battered Hearns in the 5th round. Let's talk about that one.
Well, it was a fight that happened a little bit later in both of their careers, and each of them were probably a little past their peak, which sometimes makes for a more interesting fight. Because sometimes when the reflexes have dulled just a bit, and the speed and the reflexes, punches that you normally in your prime would have evaded with relatively ease, you're now getting caught by him, which from the viewing public standpoint, a lot of times can result into a more entertaining fight, which is exactly what this was. Now, this fight was a unification bout for the WBC and the WBO super middleweight titles. Hearns had won the WBO belt, and Sugar Ray Leonard had beaten Danny Lalonde in November '88 to capture the vacant WBC super middleweight title and the WBC light heavyweight title. Now, I don't know exactly how the hell that works, how you can have belts from 2 different weight classes at stake at the same time, but whatever. But anyway, Tommy, he dropped Leonard twice. To me, he controlled most of the rounds, but kind of similar to the first fight, Leonard came on really strong and hurt Tommy a few times in the championship rounds. But unlike the first time, Tommy knew how to kind of hold on a bit. And then I also think that the 12-round distance as opposed to the 15 that they previously fought aided him greatly.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, exactly. And then Leonard would fight Roberto Duran one last time in December 7th, 1989. No, this was known as Uno Mas.
Mm-hmm.
One more time, Uno Mas. Duran was the reigning WDC middleweight champion. Guaranteed, for the Duran fight, Leonard cut his entourage from 21 people to 6. And the fight took place at the Mirage Hotel in Las Vegas. And that one went 12 rounds, but it was basically like a lopsided 12-round decision.
Yeah, and it's kind of like, even though it's a fight between 2 great fighters, that's kind of akin to the second Ali Frazier fight. Who the hell remembers it? Everyone remembers the first one and the third one. But similar to this, everyone remember the first 2 Duran fights, but who the hell remembers that? Now, to put a bow on the caveat back to the Hearns fight, the second one, even though it was a draw, Leonard was dropped twice. Leonard has openly admitted that through the years that, if he had to call it, Tommy probably won that one.
Wow.
Wow.
And there's something else also that's very interesting. I made light of it a little bit earlier, is the fact that this was in 1989. Uno Mas, December 7th, 1989.
Correct.
Roberto Duran, who we're about to talk about in a second, he would fight for another 11 years.
Yes.
He would fight for another 11 years. Okay. I mean, wow. I mean, some boxers these days, their whole career lasts 11 years, And here he was, pushing 40, you know, and about to fight another 11 more years, and which leads me to say this about our next person that we're talking about, Roberto Duran, Mr. Hands of Stone himself. He's the second boxer in the history of the entire sport to have competed over a span of 5 decades.
Yes, sir.
The only other one, do you know?
Jack Johnson, baby.
Jack Johnson, the man.
Yes, sir.
One of my all-time favorite fighters, Jack Johnson. If you have not seen the Ken Burns documentary on Jack Johnson, please watch it. The name of it is Unforgivable Blackness. It is one of my all-time favorite sports documentaries ever. And I'm also a big fan of Ken Burns anyway.
Correct.
Roberto Duran, he held the world championships in 4 weight classes: lightweight, welterweight, light middleweight, and middleweight. And he reigned as the undisputed and lineal lightweight champion and lineal welterweight champion. He's also the second boxer to compete 5 decades, known as the Hands of Stone. And Duran is regarded by many as one of the greatest boxers of all time and considered to be the greatest Latino boxer of all time.
Without question, yes, sir. And he also, Ring Magazine had him as the 5th best fighter of the last 80 years. And then I know you remember this name, died several years ago, the boxing historian, Mr. Bert Sugar.
Yes, sir.
Himself has him as the 8th greatest fighter ever. And this is, his style, like all of these guys we're talking about, all of these these 4 guys were, including Benitez, were all well-rounded fighters. They can fight, like a lot of fighters, they can only fight going forwards. If they got to go backwards, they can't fight it backwards. All of these guys could do it however you wanted. And his style was kind of like a tactical pressure fighter. He can, as I mentioned before, he combines going forward and backwards. And then he's one of the best I've ever seen in my lifetime, with the other 2 being Julio Cesar Chavez and James Toney, probably my favorite fighter, James Toney. And seamlessly blending offense and defense. Duran, he could pressure you, but he could slip while coming forward and still make you pay. Always, even if he's thinking about offense, always defensively responsible. And then once he gets inside, he's just he's a terror on the inside once he gets on the inside.
Yeah, and Roberto Duran, like I made the comment before, is like he's one of those guys that could fight you in a phone booth.
Yes.
That's his style. He's pressure fighter. He's always on you. He's always going to, be right into you the whole fight. And labeled the Hands of Stone for a reason. His hook was something else. If he caught you on the chin with that hook, you going down.
Yes.
And again, one of the great, a lot of people consider him the greatest Latino fighter of them all. Wilfred Benitez, Cesar Chavez, Hector Camacho, better than all of them.
He was. He was. The only person that was even close was Salvador Sanchez, but he tragically passed away at age 23. Had he lived, he possibly could have been in the conversation, but he didn't live long enough.
Yeah, and Roberto Duran, and unfortunately, a lot of people don't really. Everybody knows about the No Mas fight, and that's, again, like we talked about earlier, that kind of dogged his career. That basically put a before the No Mas fight. If he would have stopped fighting at that time, he would have gone to the Boxing Hall of Fame without question, like first ballot. If that never would have happened. But do you, as just looking at his career in total, do you consider his career, I think tragic is an overstatement, but maybe you could be considered as what could have been, as far as like public perception of him?
So I think he got out of it what he was supposed to get out of it, because you got to think about it. He was 5'7" with a 66-inch arm reach, and he was a natural lightweight. The man before, like I mentioned to you at the outset, when we was kind of doing the overview, before the 80s even rolled around, he was universally regarded as probably the greatest lightweight that's ever lived, just based on his body of work in the 70s. And like for instance, he had 12 successful defenses 11 by KO, man. I mean, the dude was just taking care of business in the 70s. And I just think he got with his natural small size to go from lightweight all the way up to a middleweight crown and to put a valiant challenge in one of those fights that we're going to talk about in just a moment to put up a valiant challenge in that. I think he got everything out of his career. Could he have been better had he slacked up on the partying and drinking and all of that? Possibly. But then you got to think about the other side of that. Like a lot of times, if you are, especially as often as they fought back then, if you are all boxing and all the time and no outlet, it's a possibility that his longevity may have been compromised. Possibly. He may have burned out a bit earlier had he not. No, who knows? So I pretty much think with his career, what was supposed to happen happened. He's consensus top 10 all-time fighter, pretty much regarded as the greatest lightweight that ever lived. So I think it's pretty much what happened. Pretty much happened.
Now, right after the Nomaz fight, he tried to come back or whatever. But one of the biggest turning point of his comeback was in 1982 when he signed with promoter Bob Arum.
Yes, sir.
And that was the beginning. He came back and he beat former world champion, Hall of Famer Jose Cuevas in the 4th round knockout, which earned him a second crack at the light middleweight title, this time against WBA champion Davey Moore. Okay.
Correct.
And this is, if they made a movie about Roberto Duran's career, I think that this would be the climactic moment of his career. He fought Moore. Moore was inexperienced, came in at just 12-0. But what really set it off was the fact that he won. He won the fight, and at the victory, the fight was in Madison Square Garden in 1983, June 16th, 1983. The crowd started singing him happy birthday, and he broke down into tears because that was like the completion of his comeback from the Nomaz fight. You had all of this negative publicity about him giving up. Nomaz, he walks away, turned his back on Sugar Ray, and then he comes back 3 years later, gets a title, and he's sobbing in his corner because they're singing him happy birthday. And I think that was like one of it does not rectify what happened in New Orleans in 1980, but it comes as close as you possibly can to, put his career back into at least a semi-positive light.
Yeah, and you got to think about it. Like, okay, probably made an emotional decision in the Nomaz fight because he was getting thoroughly dominated, outclassed, and probably was on his way to getting stopped, to be honest with you. But for him to put that behind him is really encouraging just in life in general. He put it behind him and tried to keep going. And then, like you mentioned before, this was his second shot at the junior middleweight, also known as light middleweight, 154-pound title against Davey Moore, because the previous contention for the belt was against Wilfredo Benitez, and he lost by a 15-round decision to Benitez. So anybody could have said, okay, I've had a great career in the 70s. I beat Sugar Ray Leonard once, even though I did that. I'm riding off into the sunset. He said, no, I'm getting back on the horse, and we gonna go at it again. And he finally hit pay dirt by going to New York, in all places, and stopping David Moore in the 8th round.
Yeah. He would later on that year, later in 1983, he would fight Marvin Hagler for the World Middleweight Championship.
Correct.
That went the full 15 rounds. We're still doing 15 rounds. After 13 rounds, the two judges had Duran 1 point ahead, and the other judge had it even. Hagler had fought tenaciously to win the final 2 rounds to get a unanimous decision win over Duran. But unbeknownst to a lot of people during the fight, that Duran had broke his hand during the fight.
Okay.
Yeah, he broke his hand. Duran had broke his hand doing and lost in 15 rounds. According to what I'm looking at here, he broke his hand during the fight, and so that kind of limited him against Hagler. He kind of just ran out of steam, and Hagler won the final 2 rounds. And despite the loss, it says here, Duran became the second man to take Hagler to a 15-round decision.
Correct.
I can never pronounce his name right. Vito Entrufomo was the other one. And he's the only one to do so while Hagler was a world champion. So that fight, which I didn't have a chance to get to see, but I can about imagine with those two guys, and we're going to talk about Hagler in a bit. He caused a lot of people problems because he's a southpaw,
Correct.
And I know, and you got a guy that fights southpaw, and you got a guy that fights you within close quarters and is constantly attacking you. That had to have been it was probably a fun fight to watch, but also a very brutal fight in the process.
Well, surprisingly, it was like it was a very, very fun fight to watch because you had two absolute masters at their craft matching wits with one another. Because Duran, being the natural smaller man, he had sense enough to know, okay, I can't go in here trying to bang with this man. And then secondly, the man had the Rock of Gibraltar for a chin, referring to Hagler. So it's hard to get him out of there. So it was a really tactical match. And then, he had to kind of prepare for everything because Hagler was a converted southpaw, but then he's known for being a guy. He was a great switch hitter, perhaps one of the greatest switch hitters of all time. And then what even made him more dangerous as far as his switch hitting is concerned, a lot of guys, they either fight southpaw a little bit, then at times they'll come out the next round and switch southpaw. A lot of times Hagler would switch from one to the other in the middle of exchanges. So, if he throws a punch, then out of the southpaw position, then switch orthodox, you think if you don't catch it, you think that left hand is farther from you than it actually is. It's right by you. Then he clip you with that left hook, and you up out of there. So he matched wits with him, but he just kind of got worn down and kind of, unfortunately, to your point, he was ahead after 13, but just ran out of steam in the 14th and the 15th and came up just short. And then just another caveat to this fight. This was the first fight where Leonard began to get inklings that he could successfully challenge in the throne Hagler, because after the fight, at the time Leonard was a commentator with Barry Tompkins on HBO, who was broadcasting the fight. And after the fight, Roberto Duran pulled him aside and was like, "Look, bro, you can beat this dude." Yeah, he told Leonard, he said, "Man, you could beat this dude." Actually, after he fought him,
right?
So,
Then June of 1984, Duran fights Thomas Hitman Hearns in a very forgettable fight, which didn't last long. It only lasted 2 rounds?
2 rounds.
It only lasted 2 rounds, and it was the first time that Duran in his career had been knocked out.
Knocked out cold. I mean, that right hand, because Tommy had already dropped him 2 previous times. Because just like I mentioned, just his natural stature, this came into play here. The man is 5'7" with an 86-inch reach advantage. Reach, fighting a guy 6'1" with a 78-inch reach. And it was just like, trying to get inside on a man that could pop that jab like a piston, and then had the right hand of Thanos, basically. That was a terrible combination of recipe for him. And, he just kept him at bay, the blinding hand speed, the blinding jab. And, he caught him against the ropes in the second round and had him completely occupied with that left jab. And he never saw the overhand right coming in. And when it connected, it sounded like a darn gunshot, literally, when it connected. And he fell face first, which for anybody that's boxed or no boxing, when you fall face first, you're out before you even hit the ground when you fall face first. And so the referee was like, screw this. I'm not going to even buy. He counted it to like 3 and like, this is over with. Forget it.
Right.
And waved it off.
You know, Duran didn't have another title fight until 1989. And this was one of the great accomplishments in his career. He won the WBC middleweight title from Iran Barkley, which is the name I remember. In February, the fight is considered one of Duran's greatest achievements. As a 37-year-old former lightweight champion, he took the middleweight crown, his 4th title, in a tough back-and-forth fight. Duran knocked Barkley down in the 11th, and Duran won a split decision. The fight was named the 1989 Fight of the Year by Ring Magazine.
Correct. Just an amazing performance. I saw it because everyone forgets that I ran the blade Barkley. Stand up, BK, Brooklyn, baby. I ain't from New York, but I just wanted to say that. But anyway, he had captured the belt by knocking out Thomas Hearns. He was getting outclassed and beaten up. He knocked out Tommy Hearns, which wound up being the upset of the year. Yeah. And Duran, he was a prohibitive underdog due to his size. And before your aforementioned the age 37, and he just the Atlantic City crowd. It was at Atlantic City at the old. And I was just there. Back in April. The boardwalk. The boardwalk. I was just there in April. But he came on. The crowd was behind him. Dropped Barkley in the 11th to kind of seal the deal. And as you mentioned before, he was fight of the year in 1989. And then when he won that, it was like, dude, we got to give it up to him at age 37, basically a natural lightweight. And I mean, Barkley was a huge super middleweight, huge. Yeah, I mean, very big. If you look at the two of them fighting against each other, he was just so much naturally bigger than Duran. And for Duran to not only beat him, but knock him down, that just speaks to his greatness.
Okay, moving on. Now we're going to talk about the Hitman, Tommy Hearns. Born 1958, he was nicknamed, along with the Hitman, I love this nickname, the Motor City Cobra.
Yes, sir.
He was tall and slender, like you talked about. He had long arms and shoulders, and which gave him versatility that he could move up and down in different weight classes. He had that ability to do that. In his career, he became the first boxer in history to win world titles in 5 different weight divisions: welterweight, light middleweight, super middleweight, and light heavyweight. He was named Fighter of the Year by Ring Magazine and the Boxing Writers Association of America in 1980 and 1984. And later, following the knockout of Roberto Duran, Hearns was known as a devastating puncher throughout his career. And as you mentioned before, he was under the tutelage of the great Emanuel Stewart beginning in 1977. 6 major world titles, 5 different weight classes, defeating future boxing Hall of Famers against Jose Cuevas, Wilfred Benitez, Virgil Hill, and Roberto Duran. And he also won the IBO title as a cruiserweight. So this guy is one of the best resumes of all the fighters that we have here on this list.
Yes, a matchup nightmare.
Yeah.
Textbook, just a couple more accolades before I kind of get into his style a bit. Ranked 18th on the Ring's list of 100 greatest punchers of all time. He's ranked 18th now, Then ranked 78th on Boxing Rec, all-time greatest pound-for-pound fighters. As I mentioned before, 6'1", 78-inch arms reach. This brother here, textbook boxer puncher, equally, but a lot of times when people use that term these days, it's usually like a guy that can punch that can box some. Right. This guy was expert level at both. He, equally adept at both. Lethal right hand, state-of-the-art jab. As I mentioned before, top 5 jab. Along with the likes of, how you like this class? Larry Holmes, Joe Louis, Sonny Liston, Muhammad Ali in terms of the jabs. In terms of right hands, top 5 right hand. Joe Louis again. Damn, Joe Louis, bad dude. Sonny Liston again. George Foreman. then you could either argue that fifth spot for Ernest Shavers. Name people may not like, but I'm giving it to him anyway. Bomb Squad, Deontay Wilder.
Right.
And my main man, Julian Jackson, for that fifth spot. But just great. And, just under the expert tutelage of Emmanuel Stewart, was just a tremendous fighter.
You're talking about, the type of people that he's not associated with, but the people that he's mostly connected to, as far as like his jab, as far as his punching power. You're talking about like the Mount Rushmore of boxing. When you bring it up Joe Louis, and you bring it up, Muhammad Ali, you bring it up, guys of that ilk, Joe Frazier, all of them, George Foreman, most recently deported George Foreman. You think about it, Tommy Hearns, one of the most versatile fighters of all time. But I think, and you may agree with me on this, or maybe you could speak on it a little bit. I think over the years, possibly, he's not really remembered the way that these other fighters are. Do you agree with that in some ways?
Agree with that somewhat, because he wasn't as, for instance, he wasn't as colorful and charismatic as Leonard was. He didn't have an entire country and region and ethnicity behind him, i.e. Roberto Duran. And then he just didn't have the toughest nails and not he was tough as nails, but not the look and the menace of Marvin Hagler. So he kind of gets lost in the shuffle, and it's a lot of people that he's not as regarded as he should be. But I'm gonna tell you right now, because I'm the boxing man. 1-on-1, head-to-head against any welterweight ever, he is hell. And people are gonna call me crazy for this, but I know boxing. Don't question the master. Never mind. I'm not above reproach. I'm just playing. He would beat the hell out of both Floyd Mayweather and Manny Pacquiao. That would be unfair. But because styles make fights,
right.
and not getting too far into the weeds on this discussion. Floyd, most people think the way to beat Floyd is you overwhelm him with punches and things like that and all that. But he's a natural counterpuncher. That conversely gives him counterpunching opportunities. Whereas Tommy Hearns, with that 6'1", 78-inch arm reach, he gonna box him from the outside. He gonna keep him at the end of that long piston jab. And what the hell is Floyd gonna have to counter? Nothing. Which in turn is gonna force him to come forward on that front foot. And then that's when that right hand comes into play. And this is when I was convinced that Hearns would beat Floyd. Floyd fought an old, ancient, past his prime, Oscar De La Hoya in like 2005. De La Hoya was past his prime, and he had all kind of hell with that jab. Mm-hmm. And he barely skated by 115, 113 over Oscar in a fight. Some, not including me, thought he won. I thought Floyd won the fight. But if you had all that trouble against Oscar's jab, no way you're going to make it home against Hearns' jab. No way.
And that's one of the things that a lot of people, including myself, do from time to time, is like try to imagine what it would be like if you had Floyd Mayweather, and I've talked to like a lot of my younger nephews and younger guys that I work with or whatever, that, Floyd Mayweather's good, but he couldn't deal with Thomas Hearns. He couldn't deal with them because, first of all, is like you talked about, that reach. First of all, Thomas Hearns would have him so far away from him, that, like Floyd's ability to counterpunch would be pretty much rendered non-efficient, non-effective, because he's too far away. He couldn't get close enough. He couldn't reach him in a million years, because he just, every time you get close, you fling that jab. Now, of course, yes, Floyd Mayweather is one of the best defensive fighters of all time. But the defense that he had, I think Thomas Hearns would just sit back and just outpoint him round by round by round. You agree with that? Or you have another?
I totally agree with that. He would be Mr. Mayweather because he'd whoop Floyd Senior too. He'd be head of the Mayweather household. But because he'd whoop them all, and Roger, even though he was a natural lightweight, if he wanted to come up, he'd whoop him too. So he would own the Mayweathers basically. But seriously though, Tommy was just a nightmare for welterweights. And then this is the thing about Tommy. Even though he's known for his right hand, I've never seen Tommy outboxed, which hints to our point earlier when he fought Leonard. Leonard had to resort to brawling to get to him because even Sugar Ray Leonard, he realized after like the first 5 rounds, man, I can't outbox this dude. I'm gonna have to step to this dude and beat him that way. Same thing with Hagler, which we're about to take. We're going to talk about in just a moment. I've never seen Tommy outbox because that state-of-the-art jab, and he had great feet. He could fight off the bounce. He could fight off his toes. He could land that right hand. He just was a very, very good fighter. Just a great fighter. And, not the joke, he whooped Raw Dog Payne too. Remember the Martin episode, the Brawl for It All in Detroit?
Yeah.
He whooped
One
Raw
of the
Dog
classic
Payne too.
Martin episodes. One of the classic Martin episodes. And to your point, to this point, one of the landmark dates in sports history. June 23rd, 1997, Hearns appeared on a WWF telecast performing in a storyline where he was taunted and challenged by pro wrestler Bret Hitman Hart, who claimed that Hearns had stole the Hitman nickname. You remember that?
Yeah, I wasn't too much messing around. I heard about it. I wasn't too much messing around with WWF. I was always a Mid-South NWA, WCW guy, you know what I mean? I used to mess around with WWF a little bit, but I remember that. I'm assuming that Tommy clocked him at least once.
Hearns ended up attacking Jim Neidhart and knocking him down in a series of punches before officials entered the ring and broke up the confrontation.
Yes, I remember Jim the Anvil Neidhart. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So. But back to the Tommy Hearns. I mean, the one thing that, of course, we're going to talk about in a little bit of detail, the fight of all fights between him and Hagler in 1985. We're going to talk about that in a bit, so just stay tuned. But you had one of the greatest, like I said, one of the greatest boxing resumes that you could possibly come up with or possibly earn throughout your career, but his career had been somewhat kind of forgotten, as we alluded to earlier. But he was, but like what Chuck was saying, man, one of the great tacticians, one of the more versatile fighters, where he could literally fight you in totally different styles, more than anybody else. Now, talking about different styles, the last person that we're talking about here is the marvelous one, and one of my all-time personal favorite fighters, Marvin Hagler. And he began boxing in 1969 in a street fight with a local boxer named Darnell Wigfall. I thought this was like a really cool backstory, whom he later defeated twice in official fights, and his friends were watching. Wigfall easily beat Hagler and added insult to injury by stealing his jacket.
Let me get that.
He competed in boxing from 1973 through 1987 and reigned as the undisputed champion of the middleweight division from 1980 to 1987, making 12 successful title defenses, all but one by knockout. Hagler holds the highest knockout percentage of all undisputed middleweight champions at 78%. His undisputed middleweight championship reign of 6 years and 7 months is the second longest active reign of the 20th century and holds the record for the 6th longest reign as champion in middleweight history. Hagler was an inductee in the International Boxing Hall of Fame, in the World Boxing Hall of Fame, and was twice named Fighter of the Year by Ring Magazine and Boxing Writers Association of America, as well as Fighter of the Decade in the 1980s by Boxing Illustrated magazine. And in 2001 and in 2004, the Ring Magazine named him the 4th greatest middleweight of all time, and in 2002 named him the 17th greatest fighter in the past 69 years.
Correct. And Boxing Rec also considers him the 29th greatest fight of all time, pound for pound. And this brother, one final thing, his career got off to a slow start because when he was it took him a long time to get a shot at the middleweight title because, everybody knows who Joe Frazier is.
Frazier. Tell this story. This is a great story. This is a great story.
Joe Frazier once told him, man, look, it's going to be hard for you to get a great fight because you already got 3 strikes against you, my man. He said, number 1, you're black. Number 2, you're a southpaw. And number 3, you're good. So it's going to be very difficult because, most people are kind of apprehensive for fighting southpaws anyway, but he's good. And his career got off to a very slow start. And as you mentioned before, he lost to, not lost. He fought Vito and to Fermo to a draw in Vegas, a fight most, including himself, felt he won. But this is important because following that fight, Hagler famously declared that from now on, he was going to let his fist be the judges going forward. Hence the birth of his increasingly ferocious style.
Yeah, he was one of those guys that he was a street fighter. He was. I had mentioned earlier of his being of the 4 fighters, he's probably the toughest one. That was the one that could take the most punishment and the one that can inflict the most damage. In a short round, in a short period of time. Sugar Ray was flashy. We all saw that. Thomas Hearns was the ultimate tactician. Roberto Duran would beat you in a war of attrition. But this guy here would just beat you up. Like put you in a corner and basically beat you down. That was his style. That was Marvin Hagler's style, which made him, once again, my favorite fighter.
Correct. And as you mentioned at the outset, when your line of questioning to, come up with a word that symbolizes each fighter, when you mentioned Hagler, I specifically said versatility, versatile, because I think as great as all these guys were, they could fight any style, anything. I think out of all of them, a lot of times people think he's just a brawler when in fact he is people like a lot of times they focus on the end result as opposed to what led to the result. And he was very versatile. He was a boxer. He was a puncher. He was a converted southpaw, but he was equally adept in either stance, just as lethal. He could fight every style in either southpaw or orthodox. And then he was a fighter that was he was a great inside fighter, but he was murder at mid-range, though. You get him right in that mid-range area, he was murder. I mean, he could outbox you, he could outbang you, he worked the body, and then the end result would be brutal knockout. So due to that, as well as his appearance, the bald-headed guy, the menacing-looking bald-headed guy with the mustache, people think, okay, this guy is just a wrecking machine, which he was, but he was quite versatile and very skillful, and to boot, all-time granite chin and all-time IQ off the charts.
After he would fight to get his first world championship, he would fight Alan Minter, who gave Hagler his second ever title shot. And the fight was it was the English boxer Alan Minter who he fought. And you have to include this fight in his biography because this was a very big turning point of his career. Faced him in Wembley Arena, which is right next to old Wembley Stadium, to all soccer fans, the cathedral. The pre-fight, the days leading up to the fight, Minter said, quote, "No black man is going to take my title," which according to him later on, he didn't really say that, but, take it as what is, Minter later said that he meant to say that black man. Does it really make it any better? Anyway, Hagler took command of the slashing punches, soon opened up a cut over Minter's eye. Hagler dominated the action, and referee Carlos Baracao halted the fight during the 3rd round because Minter had 4 cuts on his face in the 3rd round. Okay, so So the official stopped the fight. Okay. Once Barrichello waved the bout off, a riot broke out at Wembley Arena. Okay. Saying that they stopped it too soon and everything else. Clive Gammon of Sports Illustrated described the scene as a horrifying ululation of howls and boos. Hagler and his trainers had to be escorted to their locker room by a phalanx of British policemen, all the while enduring a steady rain of beer bottles and glasses. After 7 years and 50 fights, Hagler was the world middleweight champion.
Yes, and he basically, in other words, Mensa got his butt toe up, not tore, toe up.
Like we say back home, it got toe up. It got toe up.
You put that Creole on there.
That's right. It got toe up. It got toe up.
Yeah, but he whooped him and he bust him. And of course he's gonna say, well, I didn't say no black man would take my time because you got it took by a black man. So of course you couldn't go Babe Ruth and call your own shot. So now you're gonna try to retract it after the fact. No, you said it, and you got whooped. And then after that, he fought Antuofermo again, stopped him in 4. Got him up out of there in 4, and then that pretty much began the reign of terror at middleweight, in which he had 12 successful defenses, and 11 of which he won by knockout.
Right. Marvin Hagler, and I always, kind of do this. I think it may be wrong because it's like the eras are so different. But do you think that a fighter like Marvin Hagler, A, would be successful today? And B, do you think a fighter like him would be more popular today with his style than he was back in the 80s?
Great question, D. Nice. Great question. Well, the first part is easy. He would, nobody would be able to stand in his way today. The old school fighters are just so much more well-versed, well-schooled, and have infinitely more tools in their box than today's fighters. Hence, you notice the USA amateur boxing never does anything in the Olympics no more. That's how far American boxing has fallen. So he would have his way. He probably wouldn't even have any challenges now. Excuse me. Now, on to your second question. That's a bit tougher because I think on one hand, he has a destructive style, so that would open him up the popularity. But I think he also has something else counting against him because, like nowadays, it seems like in order to be popular, you have to kind of, especially as a black fighter, you have to kind of adhere to certain things. You know what I mean? Like hip hop, things like that. Whereas Marvin Hagler, he was kind of like the consummate gentleman. He was a guy, if he wasn't fighting, you didn't hear too much about him. He wasn't all out and all of that. So I think because of that, a lot of fans probably would not get behind him because just for example, not to, similar fighter in terms of style, Terrence Bud Crawford, current number 1 fighter in the world, kind of similar in terms of he can fight from both stances, knock people out left and right. And he's not as big of a star because he just he doesn't have this hip hop and, this, a lot of times, even though he's from the streets, like a lot of these guys, like nowadays, it seems like the rappers want to be athletes and the athletes want to be rappers and things like that. Whereas Marvin, even if he was in today, I don't think he would be on that tip. So I think that would be a difficult and nuanced question to answer.
I think, with his personality, he would be, how can I say this? I think he would be a breath of fresh air because he wasn't like your typical boxer, in that he was very articulate. And I hate using that word, but it's the truth. He was one of those people that could really hold a conversation and could sit there and really talk, do interviews without sounding like a grunt. You get what I'm saying? He was a very, very intelligent man. But his personality was that the only thing that he was focused on was boxing. he wouldn't today. Of course, they didn't have social media back then, but I think that he really would have a big social media presence, okay, because that just wasn't his shtick, okay? Now, Sugar Ray Leonard, on the other hand, he would be on Twitter, Instagram, everywhere you turn. You would see him, you know?
Correct.
That was him. Thomas Hearns, you see a little bit more of Thomas Hearns because he was another person who had a little bit of a charisma. He didn't have the type of charisma that Sugar Ray Leonard had, but he did have some charisma. I mean, he was on WWF for crying out loud one time, and he was on the episode of Martin, you know?
Yes.
So he was out there. Roberto Duran, that just wasn't him. If it wasn't in Panama, you didn't see it. And maybe some of the things that he did in Panama, we really don't want to see. But anyway, you know, but I think with Marvin Hagler was the fact that he was one of those guys that was just so focused on boxing that nothing else really mattered.
Correct. And
You know?
I agree with that. And it would be tough. And then you remember the old right guard commercials. You
Right.
used to say anything else would be uncivilized.
Civilized.
He had several of those. And then
I forgot about that.
Yeah.
You're right.
And then you also remember that following his career, he went to Italy to have a stellar acting career. So perhaps if he came along now, perhaps some of those acting opportunities would be here instead, which may lead to some stardom there. And then brief caveat to Roberto Duran, I think perhaps he would be a bigger star as well, simply because of demographics, because you have to think over the years from his time, the early 80s, the Latino population in the United States has grown a lot. So in addition to his fan base back home, he would probably have a fairly sizable and concrete fan base here in the States as well, which may lead to some to more stardom and things of that type.
You know, with Roberto Duran, I mean, you bring up a very interesting point because, I mean, if you had all four of these fighters fighting today with the height of social media and how important it is to offer yourself up as a quote unquote brand, so to speak, you would see that, you know, with Roberto Duran, as you're thinking about, you know, a Latino fighter, you know, from Panama, you know, known as, you know, he basically, and even with the No Mas decision, even with the No Mas fight in 1980, had that happened today, his social media platform would still be huge because people would know him because of that, you know. And would it be negative? I think it would still be, but I don't think it would be as negative today as it was really back in the early 80s. You know, he would have been known for it, obviously, and he probably would have been able to figure out a way to kind of capitalize off of that. You know what I mean? Because because you know the old saying, any publicity is good publicity. You know,
yes,
and that's the way I think that he would have, at least some of his people would have tried to spin it. You get what I'm saying?
Correct. And then I also think it wouldn't be quite as detrimental because the landscape of boxing has changed. It's not as significant now as it was back then because you have infinitely more sports, infinitely more entertainment choices. And then on top of that, too, within boxing itself, it seems like fans, in terms of that sort of thing, are much more forgiving now. Now, I'm not necessarily saying it wouldn't be detrimental under the circumstances that it happened, but it seems like now, when a guy is getting beat up and he has no chance of winning the fight, and then if the corner say, you know what, forget it, we're gonna call it. It's much more acceptable now than it was, you know, back when we were coming up. Back when we were coming up, you never threw the white flag in under any circumstances.
You know, and I think this would be a good segue into taking a short little break, and when we come back. We'll finish off the show. It's a very interesting conversation that we had here about boxing, 4 great boxers. But when we come back, we're going to go back to this date, April 15th, 1985, at the height of the Four Kings era, and what is considered one of the greatest boxing matches of all time that only lasted 3 rounds. We'll talk about that historic and epic fight right after this. You're listening to the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast right here on the Sports History Network. back here with our shout-out segment of this all-new edition of the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast. I'm Dana Augusta, along with my main man, Charles Combs, bringing you the Four Kings era of boxing during the 1980s. This has been a great conversation. If you hung with us so far, congratulations. Glad to have you aboard.
Yes, always good.
Go ahead.
Always good, man. Thank you for the invite, and thank you for bringing boxing onto the podcast for the very first time, man. It's really been a treat, and I really hope everyone is thoroughly enjoying the discussion.
April 15th, 1985, I was 12 years old, and I had just really started to get into boxing until one day my dad and my uncles was like, there's this fight coming on. We got the fight. It was at my uncle's house. It's Thomas Hearns versus Marvin Hagler for the title. I was like, okay, fine, I'll go. And I think that day was the first time I ever had my first ever bottle of beer, and I think the statute of limitations have ran out on me on that sort of thing, so I can't get punished for it. But anyway, but watching that fight, I remember the fight sitting down, getting ready for a 15-round title fight. It didn't go quite 15, but I tell you what, it was one of the most entertaining 3-round fights I've ever seen. If those of you who have a little bit of time and you want to see what boxing was like in the 1980s, watch that fight. Thomas Hearns versus Marvin Hagler, April 15th, 1985. And in this episode, we're sending that fight a shout out. It was billed as the fight, but it became known as the war. 3 minutes of violence. And within the first 15 seconds of this fight, Chuck, Hearns landed his best punch, a straight right hand to Hagler's chin. The champion stepped back, came forward, and at this point, Hagler started to walk through Thomas Hearns' punches. Basically, the first round was essentially what a lot of boxing historians consider the greatest round in boxing history. Just the first round was considered the greatest round ever.
Yes, great fight. And it turned from the fight to the war due to the pre-fight buildup because they were fighting each other. Both of them are not as colorful in many respects as Leonard nor Duran. So they had to uncommonly talk trash since they were both kind of more reserved guys to build the fight up. However, both guys took it personally, so tensions quickly boiled over, and it went from a fight to a war. And as indicated by Richard Steele, you remember that name? That's the guy that I still don't forgive for the Chavez-Milchick Taylor fight.
Yeah,
but anyway, right. He was the referee of this fight. And he said in the pre-fight introductions, when he was given the introductions, when they stand in the round before the start of the first round, he could feel the tension and he had never felt anything like it. And then when the opening bell rang, they just proceeded. Basically nearly 9 minutes of mayhem just ensued. And I mean, no boxing, just fighting. And, as you mentioned, Tommy stunned Hagler early with the right hand and then gave Hagler a cut right in the middle of his forehead. They stopped for the doctors to look at it. So Hagler was like, oh crap. Hopefully they'll stop it due to a cut. So Hagler took an all-time gamble and it paid off because he just went for broke. He went for broke and it paid off. He got Tommy in the third, but caveat, no excuses, but just caveat. In that round, part of the reason why Hagler was beginning to kind of take Tommy's right hand much better was because Tommy, in one of those exchanges, hit Hagler near the top of the head with his right hand and broke his hand. But he was still slinging it, and it's just one of the greatest fights of all time that elevated both men, and one of the rare occasions that when you reference back to a fight, no one ever talks about who won nor who lost. They just talked about how great the fight was and the great display by both warriors.
Now, if you take any one of, say, if we talk, and I hate bringing this guy up, but it's a good way of composition. Floyd Mayweather Jr., any one of his fights, okay, is basically what I consider 12 rounds of boredom. Because I've watched a number of his fights in the past number of years, and it's like watching paint dry. I mean, there's no action, nothing, and it's like when my nephews or something would have, hey, D, we having a fight, who's fighting? Well, Floyd Mayweather Jr. Forget it, I ain't going. I'm not watching it because it's going to be boring. This fight here, 9 minutes of mayhem, as you called it, and it was just that. When you talked about when Hagler got cut, it was in the second round when he got cut.
Round. Okay, second. Okay.
It was in the second round, and according to my research, it was from either an unintentional elbow or a headbutt that opened up a cut right over Hagler's forehead. Okay, and also at round two is that broken hand that you talked about that Thomas Hearns has suffered, and that they were damaging each other in this fight in this really quick condensed 3-round period. But Al Michaels, the great Al Michaels, who was the commentator for the fight, said famously, "It didn't go very far, but it was a beauty." And the fight was named the Fight of the Year by Ring Magazine. Just the Fight of the Year? Why wasn't it the fight of the decade or the fight of the millennium? It only lasted 3 rounds. This was one of the great landmark fights in the history of boxing of all time, not just in the decade of the 1980s, at least in my opinion.
Greatest fight I've ever witnessed, without question. Now, going back to Mayweather for a second, now we got to remember about Floyd. There are 2 iterations of Floyd. We had Pretty Boy Floyd, who, this was pre-hand injuries and all of that. He was getting them up out of there, man. Pretty Boy Floyd used to put the beats on these guys, man. Then when he became Money Mayweather, he had some hand issues and fighting naturally bigger guys and all of that. So, he kind of had to take a more cautious approach due to being a naturally smaller man as well as his hands, but immensely skilled. But back to this fight, it's the greatest fight I ever witnessed. And I still remember sitting in the room with my father, my uncles, my brothers, all of my friends. And when the fight, this is back in the days, it never happens now. This is back in the days when the fight used to start. I used to be so nervous, I couldn't even sit down, man, because I'm in eager anticipation to what may happen. Because literally anything could happen. It could go to decision. Either of these guys could knock the other out with one punch. Literally anything could happen at any time. But when the fight commenced, everybody's jaw just dropped because we just could not believe what we were witnessing. And it's just like they just were fighting, and they took it. It was like a personal backyard brawl, even though done at a high skill level. It was like this damn fight was personal almost.
Yeah. I mean, you brought that up. I mean, with the all of the pregame hype, the pre-fight build-up to this, with all of them talking noise to each other, which you illustrated as kind of like outside of their own character. That's just something that they just didn't do. But when they did it, I think, like what you said, is like they kind of took it personally. And that's what it looked like. Round 1 was what they call 3 minutes of violence. Okay, round 2, Hagler gets cut over his forehead, and Hearns breaks his hand on an overright to Hagler's head. Okay, moving on to the third and final round, the pace slowed. Okay, and Richard Steele, your boy, had to call timeout to examine Hagler's cut over on his head. The crowd was on his feet for the next 10 seconds before the doctor allowed the fight to continue. Hagler charged him, and then with the overright behind Hearns, overright right hand behind Hearns' ear, Hearns' legs wobbled, and Hagler was on him quickly. Hearns toppled to the canvas and then rose up at the count of 8, but collapsed into Richard Steele's arms, and then the fight was halted. So even the third round, when Hearns got knocked down, and then essentially counted out, even that was dramatic.
Correct. Richard Steele with a good stoppage for change. It's actually a good stoppage for Richard Steele, who's infamous for bad stoppages. But you don't want a fight like that to be, even though you want to see the fight, he clearly had enough, and now you're venturing as violently as they were fighting. You're now venturing into the territory where someone could get seriously hurt, perhaps
Right.
permanently disabled or killed. So that was a very good stoppage. And I remember Marvin Hagler just saying to himself, no matter what Hearns threw at him, the Pac-Man game was popular then. He said he was just like Pac-Man, he just kept taking chunks out of time. And no matter what he threw out, taking chunks out of him until there was nothing left, literally. And then backstage after the fight, Hagler visited Hearns' locker room, just obviously to check on him, because now the fight is over with. And, it's a fraternity of brothers.
Right.
Whatever was personal, whatever it said, they passed that now. And Hearns asked him, man, like, how the hell you did not fall? He like, hell, man, I don't know. I just knew I refused to fall. He said, it hurt. He said, it hurt, but I just refused to fall, man. He said, He said, I still don't know how you stayed up. And it was just a great fight that elevated, despite who won, despite who lost, it just elevated the stature of both men. And that's the way the sport should be.
Do you think it elevated the Four Kings as far as like that era?
It elevated elevated the two of them. It elevated the entire era, because at the time, this is 1985. At the time, they are like the pillars of the sport at the time. And even though the heavyweight division still rules supreme in a lot of ways from a box office standpoint, from a critical acclaim and box office standpoint, the Four Kings were running things, man. And it was just the culmination, and a lot, not a culmination, but it was definitely the high point of the Four Kings era.
Yeah.
Especially because the three fights that people always talk, well, they talk about them a lot, but in my experience, it's always that fight. It's always the controversy over the Leonard Hearns fight. And it's always no Moss. Those are typically the three things that come up the most in regards to the Four Kings. So great fight.
All right. And we're going to close out. That you wanted to send out a little quick message. Go right ahead.
Well, quick shout out to my girlfriend, E. I love you. And I said I would shout you out. And then she had we were talking about this earlier in my preparation for tonight's show. And a very interesting conversation arose, like in terms of many of these guys, they're regarded like many, highly all-time list and things like that. But We were like, okay, somehow we got on the conversation. Like, for instance, Tommy Hearns was abnormally large for a welterweight, 6'1", 78-inch reach. We were like, how good, if you keep everything the same, had Leonard had the same skill level, same everything, the dog mentality, but was 6'1" and 78 pounds. 6'1" with 78-inch reach. Or we now talking about possibly the greatest fighter ever, because he was held at 5'9", 70.5-inch reach. If you put him with Tommy's attributes and his skill set and his tenacity, I don't think nobody would have been able to touch him whatsoever. Nobody.
Chuck, that's almost scary to think about, because Sugar Ray was, I think, he wasn't as small. Duran was thick. Duran was kind of thick, so, but Sugar Ray was more of a slender guy, very smallish, on the smaller side as far as like being a fighter. But if he was like taller and had that reach with that skill set, with that, with his persona.
We're talking Sugar Ray Robinson territory now, man.
I think you surpassed Sugar Ray Robinson. I really do. I think you surpassed him. You're talking about, like, as far as like icon of boxing, like approaching Muhammad Ali status here. If you get that far, that's one of the things I've always wondered, and in researching this, I found out something. I'm gonna see how smart you are in boxing. Who's the only man to fight Muhammad Ali and Mike Tyson.
Larry Holmes.
Nope.
But Larry Holmes fought them both.
Larry Holmes fought him, but no, I take that back. There's two guys. Larry Holmes is one of them. You know who the
Michael
other?
Spinks. Michael Spinks, too. Michael Spinks fought. No, he didn't fight Muhammad Ali. Never mind. Larry Holmes certainly did. Let me see. Who else? Give me a second. Give me a second. Trevor Burbick.
There you go. See, ladies and gentlemen, like I told you, this man know his stuff.
Yeah.
This man know his stuff.
Look good, baby.
This man know his stuff.
This
man know his stuff.
Now, quick caveat. We also, one other scenario, we were like, okay, with everything, because we always talked about how great Duran was, but sometimes his size or lack thereof placed some limitations on him. We were like, okay, if all things were equal and you give him Marvin Hagler's attributes, then what do you have? No, we're talking Sugar Ray Robinson, prime Roy Jones, like once he started getting out, I'm talking about at Roy Jones' apex. Right. We're talking about he was once regarded as the greatest fighter ever, and had he quit after he won the heavyweight title, he probably would have a legitimate claim, but he stayed too long like most boxers do. But we were thinking, like, what if Duran had, with all of his abilities and his ability to fight much larger men and hold his own, if he had Hagler's natural size? We talking a guy that might could go all the way up to light heavyweight and continue to make some noise all the way up there. Because even with his limited stature, he was able to win a belt at 168 super middleweight.
Yeah. I mean, that's a lot of things to consider. That's a very, very interesting conversation. I wish I could have been a fly on the wall for that one. That's a very interesting conversation. So shout out to your girl, man. That's a good one.
Well, shout out to you, E. Thanks for the tidbit. I told you I'd include it, and my man Dana. He opened the door and allowed it. So greatly appreciate it. Love you so much.
But I really appreciate you, Chuck. And that will conclude this great boxing episode here of the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast. I'm Dana Augusta, along with Charles Combs, bidding you a very, very good evening, and we'll come back right after this to close out the show. Thank you, folks, once again for joining us here on the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast. This podcast comes to you from the Bill King Memorial Studio in the sports wing of TM4 Enterprises, located in suburban Atlanta in the shadow of Stone Mountain. Once again, please don't forget to subscribe to the show and get new episodes whenever they drop. And as always, tell people about us, tell your friends, tell your family, tell your coworkers, tell your neighbors, hell, tell a passerby on the street if you have to about our show if you really think that they like sports history. And until the next time we come talking to you, on behalf of my main man Charles Combs, I'm Dana Augusta saying so long, and we'll see you next time.
The Sports History Network, where legends live on and the past plays loud. Welcome to the place where history's proud. From gridiron glory to the hardwood stars, from the racetrack heat to Olympic bars. It's the voices, the stories, the moments you miss, told by fans and pros who live for this. Hook and Themic, the Sports History Network, where the past comes alive. Podcasts and blogs that keep the flame high. From Babe to Brady, Alley to the Dome. If it's history and sports, then this is the home. SportsHistoryNetwork.com, the headquarters of sports yesteryear.